For 2,000 years, one battlefield idea has decided fights that should not have been winnable. The idea is simple to state and almost unbearably hard to execute. Hold your strongest force back. Do not commit it. Watch your own line bend. Watch your soldiers die. Watch the battle tilt against you. And do nothing with your best weapon until the exact instant your enemy has already committed everything they have. A Roman general used this idea against overwhelming odds and won one of the most consequential battles of his century. 1900 years later, a French emperor studied that Roman general's own written account of the battle so closely that he personally dictated an extended analysis of it during his final exile. And he built the signature instrument of his entire military career around the same principle. Then, on the last day that mattered, the same idea was used against him. Not a different idea, not a clever variation. The identical discipline, the strongest force concealed, released only at the precise moment of maximum decision, deployed by the men standing across the field from him on the day his career ended. How does the same idea build an empire and then, in someone else's hands, end it? That is the question this script answers, in full, using 3 battlefields separated by 19 centuries and one unbroken line of military thinking. If tactical breakdowns like this are what you come here for, this is one of the best examples in military history of an idea outliving every empire that tried to own it. Here is how it started. Picture the field at Pharsalus from above on the morning of August 9th, 48 BC. 2 Roman armies face each other across open ground in Thessaly, in central Greece, the culmination of a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great that had been building for 2 years. Caesar's infantry lines stretch across the field, roughly 22,000 men. Pompey's infantry outnumber him significantly, but the real imbalance sits on the flank. Pompey has assembled a cavalry force several times larger than anything Caesar can field, positioned on his left wing with a specific and obvious purpose. Sweep around Caesar's exposed right flank, roll up his line from behind, and end the battle before it is properly begun. Caesar sees this coming. Every commander on that field can see it coming. The imbalance is not subtle. What Pompey's cavalry cannot see, because Caesar has placed it precisely so they cannot, is a 4th line of roughly 6 cohorts of veteran infantry, concealed behind his right flank, with orders that must have sounded strange to men trained their entire careers to advance on command. Do nothing. Wait. Let the cavalry come. Drop to ground level. Pompey's cavalry advances, several thousand horsemen moving to encircle a flank that, from where they sit, appears completely undefended. They are young, many of them aristocratic Roman cavalrymen, sons of senators and equestrians, riding into what looks like an unopposed sweep around an exposed line. They ride directly into Caesar's hidden infantry. The concealed cohorts rise and meet the charge. And here, the ancient accounts describe something specific enough to carry across 2,000 years. Caesar had reportedly ordered his men not to throw their pila in the conventional manner, but to thrust them upward, directly into the faces of the oncoming horsemen. The reasoning, as ancient historians described it, was calculated rather than simply violent. Young aristocratic riders, unused to the disfiguring wounds of close infantry combat, would break and flee rather than press forward into blades aimed at their faces. They broke. Pompey's cavalry, several times the size of anything Caesar could have matched directly, dissolved into panic and fled the field within minutes of first contact. Caesar's hidden line did not stop there. It wheeled, exactly as planned, into the now exposed flank of Pompey's infantry, the flank the cavalry had been screening. The battle that Pompey's numerical advantage should have decided in the war's opening minutes ended, instead, with his army broken and his own escape from the field beginning within hours. The reserve that never moved until the exact moment decided the battle before most of the men fighting it understood the battle had already turned. Consider what Pompey's cavalry actually experienced in the seconds before the charge broke. They had advanced expecting nothing: an open flank, an unguarded approach, the kind of unopposed maneuver that ends battles quickly and safely for the side executing it. Every visual signal available to them confirmed this expectation as they rode forward. No infantry line, no resistance forming. The advantage they had trained their entire approach around appeared to be exactly as real as Pompey had promised them. Then, without warning, built up over minutes the way an infantry advance normally telegraphs itself, several thousand veteran soldiers rose from concealment directly in their path. The tactical failure here is not primarily about troop positioning. It is about the specific vulnerability created by an enemy who believes they have already won the exchange before contact occurs. A cavalry charge, executed with full confidence of an open field, carries a psychological commitment that a charge into known, visible resistance does not. The riders at Pharsalus had already mentally completed the maneuver, swept the flank, begun the envelopment, before their horses had covered the actual distance required to do it.
When Caesar's infantry rose and met them with spears aimed at their faces rather than their horses, the disconnect between what they had expected to happen and what was actually happening produced not a tactical retreat, but a rout. Young aristocratic riders, unaccustomed to the specific horror of facial wounds in close combat, and mentally unprepared for resistance they had been assured would not exist, broke in a way that disciplined cavalry facing an anticipated obstacle typically does not. This is the mechanism the concealed reserve exploits every time it works. An enemy is never more vulnerable than in the instant after they believe the battle is already decided in their favor. Confidence collapses faster and more completely than caution does, because confidence has no contingency built into it. A wary force meeting unexpected resistance adjusts. A triumphant force meeting unexpected resistance shatters. Pompey's cavalry did not lose a fair fight. They lost the specific, narrow window in which their own certainty became the thing that destroyed them. Caesar had understood, before the battle began, precisely which moment in his enemy's advance would produce that certainty. And he had built his entire hidden line around being invisible until exactly that moment arrived. Julius Caesar wrote his own account of the Civil War, the Commentarii, a first-person record of his campaigns, composed with the specific, deliberate clarity of a general who understood that how a battle was remembered mattered nearly as much as how it was fought. Napoleon Bonaparte studied that text throughout his military education and across the length of his career. This is not an inference drawn from tactical similarity.
It is documented directly. During his final exile on the island of St. Helena, with nothing left to build and no army left to command, Napoleon personally dictated an extended military analysis of Caesar's campaigns to one of the officers who had accompanied him into exile. It was later published as Précis des guerres de Jules Caesar, a detailed professional examination of Caesar's generalship written by a man who had spent his entire adult life commanding armies and who chose, with the time remaining to him, to spend part of it thinking seriously about how a Roman general had fought battles 19 centuries earlier. This tells you something specific about how Napoleon understood his own profession. He did not treat ancient warfare as historical curiosity. He treated it as a body of doctrine worth extracting principles from, the way a modern strategist studies precedent, rather than treating history as decoration.
The principle he built his entire operational signature around was a direct descendant of what Caesar had done at Pharsalus, even if the specific tactical lineage, precisely which passages of the Commentarii shaped precisely which of Napoleon's decisions, is a traced scholarly influence rather than a documented, explicit copy. Napoleon never said, in any surviving record, "I am recreating Caesar's fourth line," What he did, consistently, across a decade of campaigns, was build his battle plans around an elite force held deliberately in reserve, uncommitted, waiting for the single moment when the battle's outcome could be decided by their weight landing in exactly the right place. That force was the Imperial Guard. Not simply an elite unit, every major army fielded elite units.
The Guard functioned specifically as Napoleon's instrument of the concealed, decisive reserve. Veteran, feared, held back through the opening and middle stages of nearly every major engagement of his career, deployed only when Napoleon himself judged that the moment of maximum decision had arrived. He had studied the general who invented this discipline. He had built his legend on practicing it better than almost anyone in Europe. He did not yet know that someone would eventually study him the same way he had studied Caesar. Here is what holding the Imperial Guard back actually required of Napoleon, battle after battle for over a decade. It required watching his own line under pressure, sometimes severe pressure, sometimes the specific, visible strain of formations bending toward collapse, while the single most powerful, most feared, most reliable force under his command stood motionless, waiting for an order that had not yet come. Every subordinate commander on a stressed section of the line understood, in the middle of that pressure, that reinforcement existed, that it was close, that committing it now would almost certainly stabilize whatever was breaking in front of them. Napoleon's discipline was refusing that request, repeatedly, until the specific conditions he was watching for had actually developed. This is harder than any other decision available to a battlefield commander, and it is worth being precise about why. Attacking is difficult, but it requires a single judgment made once at the start. Defending is difficult, but it is largely reactive. Respond to what the enemy does. Holding a decisive reserve back requires a commander to make the same difficult judgment continuously, moment by moment, for hours, against the accumulating pressure of his own army's visible suffering and his own subordinates' repeated reasonable requests for exactly the resource he is refusing to release. The judgment required was not simply patience. It was a specific tactical literacy, the ability to read an enemy's formation and recognize the precise moment their own commitment had become total, the moment equivalent to Pompey's cavalry believing the flank was already theirs, the moment an enemy line had extended, exhausted its own reserves, or created the specific gap that a fresh, decisive force could exploit completely rather than merely support. Commit the Guard too early, and you have simply reinforced a battle that was still undecided, spending your best asset on marginal advantage rather than total victory. Commit it too late, and the moment that would have made it decisive has already closed, and you are throwing a tired, diminished force into a battle whose outcome, the delay, has already determined. If this is the kind of tactical breakdown you come here for, hit subscribe, because what happens when this exact doctrine gets turned back on the man who built it is the part most accounts rush past. Napoleon read that window correctly across most of his career. Austerlitz, Friedland. Battle after battle where the Guard's late, decisive commitment turned advantage into rout, exactly as Caesar's fourth line had done at Pharsalus 19 centuries earlier. The doctrine worked because Napoleon had genuinely mastered something extraordinarily difficult. Not courage, not aggression, but the specific discipline of doing nothing, visibly, while everyone around him needed him to do something. On June 18, 1815, he would need that discipline again. This time, it would not be his alone to use. Picture the field at Waterloo from above, on the afternoon of June 18, 1815. The Duke of Wellington's Allied army holds a ridge near the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, south of Brussels, a defensive position chosen with the same tactical literacy Napoleon had spent his career developing. Napoleon's French army attacks repeatedly through the day, infantry assaults against the ridge, a massive and ultimately cloudy cavalry charge against Allied squares that held their formation under sustained pressure, artillery bombardment that grinds at the Allied line for hours without breaking it. Wellington has reserves. He does not commit them. Drop to ground level, inside that pressure, for the hours this actually took. Allied units along the ridge take casualties, bend, in places nearly buckle. And Wellington, watching exactly what Napoleon had watched from the other side of countless battlefields, refuses the same request Napoleon's subordinates had made of him for over a decade. Commit the reserve now. Stabilize the line now. Relieve the pressure now. Wellington later described the day, in terms that survive in multiple accounts, as one of the hardest fought battles of his life. He held anyway. To the east, beyond the range of what French scouts could initially confirm with certainty, Marshal Blucher's Prussian army was closing the distance toward the field. Delayed by terrain and by the previous day's fighting, but coming. At the scale of the entire campaign, Blucher's force functioned as something Napoleon had never had to account for at Austerlitz or Friedland. A second, independent reserve, arriving from outside the battle Napoleon could see, timed by circumstances no single commander on the field fully controlled. By late afternoon, with Wellington's line still holding and Blucher's Prussians beginning to engage the French right flank, Napoleon made the decision his entire career had trained him to make at exactly this kind of moment. He committed the Imperial Guard. They advanced up the slope toward the Allied center in the formation that had turned advantage into rout on a dozen previous battlefields. Veteran, feared, the instrument that had never yet failed him at the moment he judged decisive. Wellington's line, reinforced in the specific sector the Guard struck by troops he had held back for exactly this contingency, met them and did not break. The Guard fell back. Along the French line, the retreat of the force that had never before failed to decide a battle produced a collapse in morale that spread faster than any tactical explanation could account for. The army that had followed Napoleon's reserve into victory after victory watched it fail to produce one this time. And the psychological weight of that failure did what direct casualties alone might not have. The French army broke. Napoleon's military career, in any meaningful sense, ended on that ridge, against a line held by a commander who had done, with more discipline and better timing, exactly what Napoleon had spent his life teaching himself to do. Put the three moments beside each other. At Pharsalus, Caesar's timing was correct because he understood the exact instant his enemy's cavalry would believe the battle was already won, and he built an entirely concealed line around being invisible until that specific instant arrived, no earlier and no later. At Austerlitz and Friedland and the battles that built his legend, Napoleon's timing was correct for the same underlying reason. He had internalized, through study and practice, the same tactical literacy Caesar had demonstrated. The ability to read an enemy's overextension and to hold his own decisive force back through every stage of pressure that did not yet represent that specific moment. At Waterloo, the timing that decided the battle did not belong to Napoleon at all. It belonged to Wellington, who held his own reserves under exactly the kind of sustained pressure that had, in Napoleon's hands, always eventually broken an enemy line. And who did not break because Wellington was practicing the identical discipline against the man who had spent a decade perfecting it. And it belonged, at the scale of the full campaign, to the timing of Blucher's arrival, an external reserve Napoleon could not see, could not control, and could not incorporate into the tactical calculation his entire career had trained him to make with confidence. Napoleon's commitment of the Guard was not, on its own terms, an obviously wrong decision. By the specific tactical logic that had worked for him repeatedly across a decade, the moment he chose had real justification. Wellington's line was under severe pressure. Hours of assault had visibly strained it, and the conditions resembled, closely enough, the conditions under which the Guard had decided battles before. What Napoleon's judgment could not fully account for was an opponent who had studied the same discipline and executed it with equal or greater precision, combined with a second reserve arriving from entirely outside the tactical picture he was reading. The doctrine that had made Napoleon's career assumed, implicitly, that he was the only commander on the field capable of executing it correctly. At Waterloo, he was not. The idea that concealed, disciplined patience defeats premature commitment does not become less true because the man who mastered it eventually faced someone who had mastered it better on the one day it mattered most. It becomes, if anything, more completely proven, a principle powerful enough that losing to a better version of your own doctrine is a coherent, documented outcome rather than a contradiction of everything that came before it. The concealed decisive reserve did not end with cavalry and muskets. Modern military doctrine across multiple national armed forces still addresses the principle directly, under different names, applied through different technology, but built around the identical discipline Caesar demonstrated at Pharsalus. Operational reserves held back from an initial engagement. Air power withheld until an enemy's own commitment creates the specific window that makes its use decisive rather than merely supportive. The underlying judgment required of a modern commander choosing when to release a held force is, in its essential structure, the same judgment Napoleon spent his career developing and ultimately lost to a better-timed version of at Waterloo.
What has not changed across 2,000 years of technological transformation is the specific difficulty at the center of the doctrine: holding your strongest asset back while every visible pressure argues for using it now. That discipline, refusing your best resource under mounting pressure until the precise moment it can be decisive rather than merely helpful, appears far beyond battlefields. In any high-stakes competitive domain where committing your strongest move too early gives an opponent time to adjust to it. The principle outlived the Roman Republic. It outlived the French Empire. The technology carrying it forward keeps changing. The discipline it demands of the person holding the reserve has not changed at all. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean is quiet farmland today, marked by a monument, the Lion's Mound, raised decades after the battle from earth taken from the very ground the fighting crossed. Visitors climb it and look out over gently rolling Belgian countryside that gives almost no visual sense of the specific hours during which an empire's fate turned on whether a line would hold and a reserve would arrive in time. The field at Pharsalus in central Greece offers even less. No monument marks it with the same visibility. The ground where Caesar's concealed cohorts rose against Pompey's cavalry is farmland now, indistinguishable on casual inspection from any other stretch of the Thessalian plain. Both places share the same essential quiet, ordinary ground that once held the exact moment when patience, held to its absolute limit and then released with precision, decided something far larger than the battle itself. Julius Caesar taught the world this discipline by writing down, in his own hand, exactly how he had executed it.
Napoleon Bonaparte studied that written record closely enough to build an empire on its lessons, and closely enough, in his final exile, to spend some of his last capacity for serious thought analyzing the general who had shown him how. The same idea that built his legend met, on one ridge in Belgium, a version of itself executed with more discipline than his own. An idea 19 centuries old defeated the man who had learned it best, using nothing but a better sense of timing than his. Drop a comment. Do you think Napoleon lost Waterloo because he mistimed the Guard, or because Wellington and Blücher simply executed the same principle better than he did? I've never seen the comments agree on this one, and I read every single one. Subscribe if breakdowns like this are what you come here for. There is a lot more military history built on ideas like this one still to cover.